Dr. Pollen, thank you for talking to us and joining us on this day. First of all, I'd like us to start with just getting an understanding of the extent of the problem and how you would describe the situation based on the weather patterns we're experiencing in the southern region due to El Nino.
I could describe it as worrying, fundamentally because substantial resources, both human and capital inputs into the agricultural sector were expended in order to ensure that we have adequate crop for our consumption as a country. So it's essentially worrying that this has happened, the fact that we have an inadequate rainfall.
As it is a concern for the DMMU, I believe you also understand that this is a concern for a lot of Zambians, understandably so, because agriculture in Zambia has been quite reliant on rainfall, which we've not been experiencing over the last few weeks, over many a few weeks actually. And this to an extent threatens the food security of the country, or should I ask you if it does?
Okay, so first of all, the situation is worrying in terms of the fact that should we continue on current trajectory, we don't expect to have the yields that we anticipated. And I think based upon the way in which people had responded to growing maize, we should have expected actually to have had a bumper harvest now. So this is, based on the prevailing weather patterns, we are definitely going to be below the expectations. In terms of food security, the government is doing everything possible to ensure that there is food security in the country. One of the key issues, for example, that the government undertook was to preempt what was going to happen. I mean, we knew around November and even much earlier than that this would be on El Nino year. And we, in anticipation of this weather pattern, as government undertook some drought insurance through the African Risk Capacity as an agency of the African Union. And we brought on board the World Food Programme, who also have, on behalf of the Zambians, initiated a replica program. So if you recall that in 2022, Zambia received $5.3 million in insurance payouts due to having insured against the drought or prolonged dry spells during that period of time. So if there's anything to compare in terms of the scale of devastation that we experienced in this time, we expect at least a similar amount, substantially more, based on how the parameters will play out and will be triggered in terms of the model that is being used by the African Risk Capacity called Africa Risk View. So the government is putting all the pieces in place, the anticipatory action that was undertaken, the early action that was undertaken in seeing that this is what the situation would look like, but at the same time, ensuring that there are adequate reserves, carryover stock from the previous agricultural season just to supplement ongoing efforts. So from the perspective of the government, I'm quite optimistic that we are mobilizing all the supports internally to ensure that we can adequately respond to deficits in areas that would require that additional humanitarian support.
The Zambia Meteorological Department made it very clear that, we would have a situation like this one. There was an anticipated dry spell, and this is based on the forecast that you've just also talked about. And based on this, I want to ask if you think we have responded well, that people still went ahead and planted, despite the idea that, despite it being clear that we were not going to have rainfall, but they were preparing for rainfall that we were not going to have. Do you think we've responded well as a country to this warning?
I think there are lessons. I think there are lessons to be learned from this in terms of the extent to which the early warning advisories were sent out by the Meteorological Department, including our department as well. But to then suggest that the advisories were 100% accurate in terms of how we're experiencing the dry spells now would also not be completely correct. So we can argue that the model tells us that there will be an episode of a dry spell, that the length of the dry spell is not immediately apparent or accurate at the time of forecasting. So this is something that you only look at in retrospect. So people were optimistic that it wouldn't be as bad as it is now, and they came and they did what they had to do.
Perhaps we can talk about the response by the DMMU, and I'd like to ask what the intention is on how the DMMU is going to respond. How does the DMMU respond to situations like this one, and perhaps with specific reference to what the intention is for this specific circumstance?
No, thanks a lot for that. Firstly, just to kind of put some context into what role DMMU plays and what it is that it intends to do, is that every year the DMMU conducts what is known as an in-depth vulnerability and needs assessment. And in this vulnerability and needs assessment, we have what is known as the Zambia Vulnerability Assessment Committee, the ZVAC, which is essentially a consortium of government as well as non-government stakeholders. So we have NGOs, we've got international partners, international organizations that sit on the Zambia Vulnerability Assessment Committee. And we go out in the field to collect data post-harvest to ascertain the level of devastation post-rainy season and harvest time, to understand which areas are deficit areas, which areas are areas that are surplus, and what logistical arrangements then would need to be put in place in order to reallocate those resources efficiently to support the most vulnerable communities in deficit areas. So that is undertaken every year, and that comes around May to June, and then we have a report ready in September. And what we call the lean period, which is a period between October and March, there often is an annual program of relief distribution, humanitarian support to the affected areas. So what this drought is telling us is that the lean period now will have to be extended beyond the March period, essentially telling us that there will be more people that would require additional support over an extended period of time. So I just thought I should add that context so that you could properly understand and place everything in its right context in terms of the role of the DMMU and how it ensures that resources are judiciously and prudently utilized, reaching the intended beneficiaries.
Do you have an assessment of the extent of this problem, where exactly this problem is prominent, and how many people are going to be affected by the outcome of what's currently happening?
So the Ministry of Agriculture hosts what is known as a crop monitoring committee, which tells us expected yields, which is also indicative of the areas that are likely to be deficit and areas that are likely to be surplus. In essence, what that does is that it tells us what the impact of the dry spell is. Theoretically, there is a potential also to then conduct a post-harvest survey. Then you compare the pre-harvest crop monitoring exercise versus the post-harvest survey. What that will do is give us a more accurate picture of what would be available for the country from an aggregate perspective, and then help us then to map out which areas will be deficit areas requiring that type of support. So this is an ongoing exercise now, being spearheaded by the Ministry of Agriculture, and we sit on the crop monitoring committee ourselves to ascertain the level of damage. We did undertake the other weekend a rapid assessment just to appreciate what was going on the ground, assessing the extent of devastation. And it is very, very clear that unirrigated, cropped areas are experiencing substantial stress. So this is more than a week ago, and there hasn't been rain up to now, and I can only imagine that the situation has only gotten worse. But also what is clear from there is the stark contrast of the irrigated areas that have thriving crops. So we're yet to know the extent of irrigation and the expected yields from there in relation to the models that tell us about the national consumption patterns and the expected national consumption, and therefore an assessment of what the deficit would be and how to fill that gap.
You've talked about irrigation, and I'm curious to find out, because you were there, the irrigation that you talk about, these farms that are doing well because of irrigation, if this is large-scale irrigation or this is irrigation that people would ordinarily have access to even if they were not super rich?
No, I mean, commercial irrigation is an extremely capital-intensive undertaking, so it tends to be quite expensive. But the president has been very emphatic on the issues of water harvesting. As you know, Zambia, with adequate infrastructure in irrigation, we have adequate water bodies to support a range of irrigation, mini irrigation, community irrigation projects. But if you want to ask in terms of the value, the quantum in monetary terms of commercial irrigation is quite capital intensive and can be quite expensive.
So I'd like to also hear some of the long-term as well as short-term resolutions that have been put in place and some of the solutions that you're going to implement as the DMMU going forward in dealing with some of these farmers that are experiencing this challenge and even others that may not.
I mean, thanks again. That's a really important question. Right now, I mean, there's not much you can do because there's not much you can do unless you can access water and bring it there. But we've seen even just from social media videos and ourselves who went on the ground that there's very limited, if any at all, interventions that can be taken to reverse the trend of wilting crops. Some of the crops have actually wilted beyond any recovery whatsoever. So there's very little that can be done at this point. But we continue to be optimistic. We've had 2 days of showers lasting for anywhere from 2 minutes to 10 minutes across Lusaka. So, you know, those of us who believe in miracles continue to be optimistic. But no, you know, in actual fact, outside of that miracle, there's really not much that can be done. In terms of the long-term measures, I think what this has taught us is to rethink the idea of adaptive agricultural practices. We are in conversation with some individuals who are looking at regenerative agriculture, for example, or adaptive agricultural practices, which focus on soil health and restoring that natural adequacy of the soil in containing moisture and having adequate nutrients, even in the midst of insufficiency of rainfall. But in addition to that, I think this is an opportunity for us to rethink the kinds of crops that we plant. Can we have more drought-resistant varieties of the same crop or of substitutes, such as sorghum and millet, things such as cassava, and so forth and so on. So those are some of the options that we're considering. And I think going forward, you see a lot of this being implemented as we do it in a stepwise manner.
Let's talk about the broader context. In the worst case scenario that this situation impacts the country negatively and there is a shortage of food supply in the country of the main food, the staple food of the country, and some people vulnerable in society might need some help. Does the DMMU have the capacity needed?
We do have capacity as DMMU. I mean, DMMU is just an agency of the government in the wider context of the government. We sit on the Food Security Task Force, which is chaired by the Secretary to Cabinet. Minister of Agriculture sits, Minister of Green Economy sits. We also have the Defense Forces sitting there. So the capacity is not just to be seen within the context of the mandate and operations of DMMU, but the broader whole of government mandate in ensuring that food security is number one national security.
Finally, perhaps what a lot of farmers might be wanting to hear is if there's anything they can be doing, and if there is anything, what exactly can they do to protect themselves from the shock that will come after this this situation and its result is sure?
We like I indicated, it's very, very difficult to suggest right now that there's a leverage to work against what the weather has given us right now if you don't have irrigation infrastructure. And over decades, we know that Zambia's agricultural sector has depended upon the vagaries of the weather, where you have good rainfall distribution, you have good harvest. And when you don't, then you have a very poor harvest. So there's very little